Hello everyone. I know you watch this video to accompany you to sleep. So if you like this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, don't forget to tell me where you are from and what time you watched this video. Story 1. On July 15th, 2008, a woman named Cindy Anthony called 911 from her home in Orlando, Florida, her voice shaking with a mix of panic and fury that dispatchers could hear clearly in the recording. Her granddaughter, 2-year-old Kaylee, hadn't been seen in over a month. And her own daughter, Kaylee's mother, 22-year-old Casey Anthony, had known the entire time and hadn't told anyone. What followed became one of the most heavily covered, most emotionally charged criminal trials in modern American history, a case that would end not in the conviction most of the country expected, but in a verdict so controversial it reshaped how millions of Americans thought about circumstantial evidence, reasonable doubt, and the gap between public certainty and legal proof. A missing child, hidden in plain sight. The timeline that eventually emerged was almost impossible for investigators, and later the public, to fully absorb. Kaylee Anthony had last been seen alive, according to the timeline prosecutors would later construct, on June 16, 2008. For the next 31 days, Casey continued living an outwardly ordinary life, moving in with her boyfriend, going to nightclubs, entering a hot body contest at a local bar, all while telling different family members different stories about where her daughter was. She told her mother Kaylee was with a nanny. She claimed, at various points, that she was staying with the nanny at a different address, or traveling, or simply unreachable for a few days at a time. Cindy Anthony, growing increasingly suspicious as the excuses piled up and her calls to Casey went unanswered for days, eventually tracked down Casey's car at a towing impound lot, where the smell coming from the trunk was so overwhelming that a tow yard employee had already called the police himself, believing something had died inside it. The 911 call that changed everything. It was against this backdrop that Cindy finally called 911 on July 15th, after confronting Casey directly and getting, by her own account, only more evasions. During the call, Cindy told the dispatcher plainly that she believed something was deeply wrong, that her granddaughter had been missing for a month, and that her daughter's car smelled, unmistakably, like death. Casey was arrested that same day. Her initial story to police, once she was finally forced to give one, was that Kaylee had been kidnapped a month earlier by a babysitter, a woman she identified by name, at an address that, when police went to check it, turned out not to exist. The babysitter herself, when investigators eventually located her through other means, had never met Casey or Kaylee at all. It was, from the very first days of the investigation, a story riddled with holes, and it would only get more complicated as searchers spent the following months looking for a little girl that Casey's own behavior suggested, with mounting certainty, she already knew wasn't coming home. A search that captivated the country. Volunteer search efforts for Kaylee began almost immediately and continued for months, organized in part by Texas EquiSearch, a non-profit specializing in missing persons searches. Media coverage of the case exploded well before any resolution was reached, driven partly by the sheer strangeness of Casey's behavior in the weeks after her daughter's disappearance, party photos, a new tattoo reading La Bella Vita, an apparent absence of visible distress that struck much of the watching public as deeply, viscerally wrong for a mother whose child was supposedly missing. By the time searchers finally found what they'd been looking for, 5 months had passed. And what they found would only deepen, rather than resolve, the mystery of what had actually happened to Kaylee Anthony. An open investigation with a mother in custody, a country increasingly convinced it already knew the outcome, and a family divided, at least publicly, between grief and denial. The search widens. Through the late summer and fall of 2008, search efforts around Orlando continued, aided by volunteers, cadaver dogs, and increasingly sophisticated investigative techniques. Casey remained in custody the entire time, having been denied bail given the circumstances of the case and the concern that she posed a flight risk. Investigators, meanwhile, continued building a case out of circumstantial and forensic evidence gathered from Casey's car and computer. Forensic experts examined the trunk of the vehicle where the odor had first raised suspicion, eventually testifying that the specific chemical signature detected was consistent with human decomposition, testimony the defense would spend considerable effort challenging throughout the trial. Separately, computer forensic analysts recovered search history from a computer used in the Anthony household, showing searches for terms including chloroform, conducted in the weeks before Kaylee was last seen alive. Evidence prosecutors would later argue suggested premeditation, though the defense would dispute both the search's timing and who had actually been at the keyboard when it occurred. December 11, 2008. On December 11, 2008, a meter reader working in a wooded area not far from the Anthony family home noticed a bag partially exposed near the roadside. Inside were skeletal remains, along with duct tape found near the skull. 8 days later, on December 19th, authorities formally confirmed what searchers, and much of the watching public, had feared since Cindy Anthony's original 911 call 5 months earlier. The remains belonged to Kaylee Anthony. A case transformed. The discovery of Kaylee's remains fundamentally reshaped the investigation, moving it from a missing persons case with a strong undercurrent of suspicion into a formal homicide investigation. Prosecutors began building toward capital murder charges, initially signaling they would not seek the death penalty before reversing that position in April of 2009 and formally announcing they would pursue it. The location and condition of the remains would become central to the eventual trial, with prosecutors arguing the evidence, including the duct tape found near the skull, pointed toward deliberate suffocation, while the defense would offer an alternative explanation entirely: that Kaylee's death had been a tragic accident, not a murder, and that what followed had been the product of a family in crisis making increasingly desperate, poorly considered decisions rather than evidence of a killing. That competing narrative, accident versus murder, panic versus premeditation, would come to define nearly every moment of the trial that followed. A trial that wouldn't begin for another 2.5 years, delayed by pretrial motions, a change of presiding judge, and the sheer complexity of preparing a capital case that had already become one of the most publicly scrutinized in the country. When Casey Anthony's trial finally opened on May 24, 2011, in an Orlando courtroom, both sides delivered opening statements that offered the jury two almost entirely incompatible accounts of what had happened to Kaylee, accounts so different they seemed, at times, to describe two separate cases entirely. The prosecution's case. Prosecutor Linda Drain Burdick opened by rejecting Case's original kidnapping story outright, telling the jury plainly that Kaylee had not been abducted by anyone. Instead, prosecutors laid out a theory built around motive and method: that Casey, a single mother whose lifestyle had grown increasingly incompatible with the demands of raising a toddler, had used chloroform to subdue her daughter before suffocating her with duct tape, then disposed of her body in the wooded area where it would remain undiscovered for months. To support this theory, prosecutors presented an extensive body of circumstantial evidence: the chloroform-related internet searches, forensic testimony about the odor detected in the trunk of Case's car, the placement and type of duct tape found near Kaylee's remains, and, perhaps most damaging in the eyes of many jurors and observers, a detailed accounting of Case's behavior during the 31 days her daughter was missing, including partying, a new boyfriend, and a tattoo obtained. During the exact window when, prosecutors argued, a genuinely grieving or panicked mother would have been searching desperately for her missing child, not celebrating her newfound freedom. The defense's counter-narrative. Defense attorney Jose Baez offered the jury an entirely different account, one built around tragedy and family dysfunction rather than premeditated murder. He argued that Kaylee had drowned accidentally in the family's backyard swimming pool, and that Casey, in a state of panic and poor judgment rather than malice, had concealed the death rather than reporting it, assisted, Baez suggested, by her father, George Anthony, who Baez claimed had helped dispose of the body and orchestrated the eventual cover story. Baez also introduced a considerably more explosive claim during opening statements: that Casey had been sexually abused by her father throughout her childhood, and that this history of abuse helped explain both her psychological detachment and her family's dysfunctional response to Kaylee's death. George Anthony denied these allegations directly and unequivocally when questioned about them later in the trial, and the judge would eventually instruct the jury that no evidence had been presented to substantiate the abuse claims, limiting how much weight, if any, they could give the allegation in their deliberations. A trial built on circumstance. What made this case genuinely difficult to predict, much like the Peterson trial 7 years earlier, was the absence of any direct evidence establishing precisely how or when Kaylee had died. There was no confession, no witness to the death itself, and critically, forensic experts were unable to determine a definitive cause of death from the skeletal remains recovered 5 months after Kaylee went missing, a gap the defense would return to repeatedly throughout the trial, arguing that prosecutors were asking the jury to convict on a theory of murder they couldn't actually prove through physical evidence. Prosecutors, in turn, argued that the totality of circumstantial evidence, the chloroform searches, the odor evidence, the duct tape, and above all, cases on documented behavior and repeated lies to law enforcement and her own family, was more than sufficient to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, regardless of the absence of a definitive medical cause of death. 6 weeks of testimony. Over the following 6 weeks, the trial worked through nearly 400 pieces of evidence and testimony from a wide range of witnesses, forensic specialists debating the significance of the trunk odor, computer experts contesting who had actually conducted the chloroform searches and when, and family members, including both of Case's parents, offering testimony that at times seemed to help the prosecution and at times seemed to complicate it considerably. George Anthony's testimony proved particularly fraught, given his direct denial of the abuse allegations and his description of the smell in Case's car trunk as resembling, in his own experience, the smell of human decomposition. Testimony that cut against his daughter's defense even as Baez continued suggesting George himself bore some responsibility for the cover-up. By the time both sides rested, the defense notably choosing not to have Casey testify in her own defense, the jury faced an unusually difficult task, deciding, without a clear account of how Kaylee had actually died, whether the accumulated circumstantial evidence was enough to convict her mother of murder. That verdict, when it came, would stun much of the country. On July 5, 2011, after nearly 6 weeks of testimony and less than 11 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Not guilty on the charges of first-degree murder, aggravated child abuse, and aggravated manslaughter of a child. Casey Anthony was convicted only on 4 misdemeanor counts of providing false information to law enforcement, the lie she had told police about the fictitious babysitter and Kaylee's supposed kidnapping. A country unprepared for the outcome. The reaction to the verdict was immediate, visceral, and overwhelmingly negative toward the outcome itself. Crowds gathered outside the Orlando courthouse audibly gasped and, in some cases, booed as the verdict was read. Cable news coverage, which had already devoted enormous attention to the trial for weeks, extended into round-the-clock analysis attempting to explain how a jury could acquit a defendant whom the vast majority of the watching public had already, based on months of media coverage, concluded was guilty. Legal analysts pointed to the fundamental gap between what the public had absorbed through media coverage and what the jury had actually been asked to evaluate under the law. The jury's task was never to determine whether Case's behavior during the 31 days her daughter was missing was reprehensible. Few disputed that it was. Their task was narrower and more demanding, deciding whether prosecutors had proven, beyond a reasonable doubt, the specific mechanism and intent behind Kaylee's death. Without a determined cause of death, without a confession, and without any witness to what had actually happened, several jurors later explained in post-trial interviews that they simply couldn't reconcile the available evidence with the certainty the law required for a murder conviction. Sentencing and release. 2 days after the verdict, on July 7, 2011, Casey was sentenced on the misdemeanor lying charges to 4 years in prison, along with a fine. Given credit for the nearly 3 years she had already spent in custody awaiting trial, along with credit for good behavior, her sentence was effectively already served. She was released from custody shortly after midnight on July 17, 2011, walking past roughly 100 protesters who had gathered outside the jail to voice their anger at the verdict. A verdict that never settled. In the years since, the Casey Anthony case has remained a frequently cited example of the gap between public conviction and legal proof, a case where extensive circumstantial evidence and widely publicized behavioral red flags nonetheless failed to meet the exacting standard required for a criminal conviction. Unlike the Peterson case, where circumstantial evidence proved sufficient to convince a jury, the Anthony case produced the opposite outcome from broadly similar ingredients: a suspicious timeline, a defendant's documented deception, and forensic evidence that, while suggestive, never definitively established how the victim had died. What has never been resolved, and likely never will be, is the central question the case was built around. What actually happened to Caylee Anthony in the days before she disappeared? The jury's verdict answered a narrow legal question: whether guilt had been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. It did not, and was never intended to, answer the broader human question that has continued to hang over this case for more than a decade since. That unresolved tension, a legal verdict that settled nothing in the court of public opinion, is part of what makes this a difficult story to close out neatly. We'll do our best in the final chapters, starting with what happened to Caylee Anthony afterward, and how this case reshaped public conversation about the space between suspicion and proof. When Caylee Anthony walked out of the Orange County Jail just after midnight on July 17, 2011, she stepped into a kind of public life almost no acquitted defendant in American history had experienced before. Free under the law, but branded, in the eyes of much of the country, as guilty regardless of what the jury had decided. An uneasy freedom. In the immediate aftermath of her release, Caylee largely disappeared from public view, relocating and living under tight security given the volume of ongoing threats against her. Texas EquiSearch, the volunteer organization that had spent months and considerable resources searching for Caylee before her remains were found, filed a lawsuit against Caylee seeking to recover the costs of those efforts, a case that was later settled out of court. Caylee also faced a separate, unrelated legal matter from before Caylee's disappearance, a check fraud case for which she had already pleaded guilty, resulting in a year of probation that continued even after her acquittal on the murder charges. A fractured family. The Anthony family itself never fully recovered from the trial's fallout, particularly given the sexual abuse allegations Caylee's defense team had leveled against George Anthony during the proceedings. George continued to deny the allegations publicly and consistently in the years that followed, and the relationship between Caylee and her parents remained, by most public accounts, deeply strained for years afterward, marked by periods of estrangement and only occasional, guarded reconciliation. Cindy Anthony, whose original 911 call had set the entire case in motion, continued to publicly maintain that Caylee's death had been an accident rather than a murder, a position that aligned with the defense's trial narrative but that many observers found difficult to reconcile with the original panic and suspicion audible in her 2008 911 call. Caylee's life in the years since. In the years following her release, Caylee has largely avoided sustained media engagement, though she has periodically resurfaced in limited interviews and documentary appearances, including a 2017 sit-down interview and later documentary participation, in which she discussed aspects of the case without offering the kind of definitive account of Caylee's death that many viewers continued to hope for. She has maintained, in these limited public statements, that she does not know exactly how her daughter died, a position consistent with her defense's trial argument, but one that has continued to leave many observers unsatisfied. Reports in subsequent years indicated Caylee pursued private investigative work, in one instance reportedly assisting with photography-related work connected to legal investigations, a detail some found notable given her own history with the justice system, though these ventures received considerably less public attention than the trial itself had. A case that refuses to fade. More than a decade after the verdict, the Caylee Anthony case continues to generate documentaries, podcast series, and periodic renewed media attention, reflecting a rare quality among high-profile acquittals, an unresolved central mystery that neither the trial nor the years since have managed to definitively answer. Unlike cases where a verdict, however controversial, eventually settles into historical consensus, this one has retained an unusual staying power precisely because the core question, what actually happened to Caylee, was never conclusively answered by either the physical evidence or Caylee's unlimited public statements in the years since. That enduring uncertainty, and what this case ultimately revealed about the American public's relationship with televised trials and reasonable doubt. The Casey Anthony verdict didn't just shock the public. It became, almost immediately, a case study for legal scholars, journalists, and jury consultants trying to understand exactly how a jury exposed to the same evidence as a convinced public could reach such a different conclusion. Reasonable doubt, explained the hard way. In post-trial interviews, several jurors offered a consistent explanation that ran counter to much of the public narrative. They didn't believe Casey was innocent in any broader moral sense. Multiple jurors described believing that she likely knew more than she'd ever admitted about how Kaylee died, and that her behavior in the weeks after her daughter's disappearance was, at minimum, deeply troubling. But knowing something felt true and proving it beyond a reasonable doubt, under the specific legal standard the law required, were two entirely different things, and several jurors were explicit that the prosecution simply hadn't closed that gap with the evidence presented. This distinction became a central talking point in the weeks and months following the verdict, as legal commentators worked to explain to a frustrated public why a case that felt, from the outside, so damning had nonetheless failed to produce a conviction. Without a determined cause of death, without any witness to what happened to Kaylee, and without a confession, prosecutors had been forced to ask the jury to infer both the mechanism of death and Casey's intent almost entirely from circumstantial and behavioral evidence, a considerably heavier lift than cases built on direct physical evidence. A reference point for future cases. Legal scholars and commentators have periodically pointed to the Anthony case since as an instructive counterpoint to the Scott Peterson case decided 7 years earlier. Two circumstantial prosecutions built from broadly similar ingredients, timeline inconsistencies, forensic evidence open to competing interpretation, a defendant's own damaging behavior that produced opposite outcomes. The comparison has been used, in legal education contexts, to illustrate just how much a case's specific evidentiary details, rather than its general shape, can determine whether circumstantial evidence proves sufficient for conviction. The case also became closely associated with what's often informally called the CSI effect in reverse, not jurors demanding forensic proof that didn't exist, but rather a public, shaped by television crime dramas and confident media narratives, expecting a conviction that the actual, messier standards of criminal law didn't ultimately support given the evidence presented. Kaylee's Law. One of the case's more concrete legacies emerged in the form of legislative change. In the years following the trial, multiple states passed laws, often referred to informally as Kaylee's Law, establishing specific timeframes within which parents or guardians are legally required to report a missing or deceased child to authorities, closing a gap that had allowed Casey to go 31 days without reporting Kaylee missing without facing any specific, immediate criminal consequence tied to that delay itself. A verdict the public never accepted. Public opinion polling conducted in the aftermath of the trial consistently showed that a large majority of Americans following the case believed Casey Anthony was guilty of killing her daughter, regardless of the jury's verdict, an unusually stark gap between legal outcome and public sentiment that few other American criminal trials have produced at this scale. That gap has never meaningfully closed in the years since, even as the case has faded somewhat from daily news coverage in favor of periodic anniversary retrospectives and documentary revisitations. It's a genuinely unusual place for a criminal case to land, legally resolved, but never actually settled in the broader court of public opinion, an unresolved tension that will likely follow this case for as long as it continues to be told. Every version of this story eventually has to circle back to the same place it started. A 2-year-old girl who never got the chance to grow up, buried at the center of a case that became, for most of the country, more about a verdict than about her. Remembering Kaylee. In the retelling of this case, the forensic testimony, the legal analysis, the endless cable news debate, it's easy for Kaylee Anthony herself to become almost an abstraction, a name attached to a mystery rather than a real child who existed, briefly and fully, before any of this began. Family photographs and videos entered into evidence during the trial showed a bright, affectionate toddler, the kind of ordinary, joyful footage that exists in nearly every family's home movies. moments that stood in stark, painful contrast to the courtroom discussions of chloroform searches and decomposition odor that dominated so much of the trial's public coverage. Kaylee was 2 years and 11 months old when she was last seen alive. Whatever happened to her in the days that followed, an accident concealed out of panic, or something considerably darker, she never had the chance to grow into the person those home videos suggested she might have become. What this case leaves unanswered. Unlike most of the cases we've covered in this collection, this one doesn't end with a tidy moral, a confirmed cause of death, or a definitive account of what happened. It ends, instead, with a legal verdict that resolved the narrow question the law required it to resolve, while leaving the human question, the one most people actually wanted answered, permanently open. That's an uncomfortable place to leave a story. But it's also, in its own way, an honest one. Not every case gets the kind of resolution that makes for a satisfying ending. Sometimes the justice system does exactly what it's designed to do, protect against convicting someone without sufficient proof, and the result still leaves almost everyone unsatisfied, including, quite possibly, some of the very jurors who reached that verdict. Story 2. On the morning of June 10, 1991, 11-year-old J.C. Lee Duguid walked out of her home in South Lake Tahoe, California, toward the school bus stop just a short distance up the road. Her stepfather, Carl Probin, was outside as well, riding his bike nearby, close enough to see her the whole way, close enough, in fact, to watch what happened next unfold directly in front of him, and still be unable to stop it. A gray sedan pulled up alongside J.C. A man got out. In the space of a few terrifying seconds, he grabbed her, forced her into the car, and drove away, while Carl, pedaling furiously and screaming her name, chased the vehicle as far as he could before it outran him entirely, disappearing down the road with his stepdaughter inside it. It is, even decades later, one of the more agonizing details in the entire case. A father who witnessed his daughter's abduction in real time, close enough to nearly reach the car, and still couldn't prevent what was about to happen to her for the next 18 years. A search with nothing to find. What followed was an enormous, immediate search effort, federal, state, and local law enforcement descending on the small mountain community of South Lake Tahoe within hours. Search dogs combed the surrounding wilderness. Flyers with Jace's photograph papered the region and, eventually, much of the country. Thousands of tips poured in over the following weeks and months, each one chased down, each one, ultimately, leading nowhere. Carl Probin's account of the car, its color, its general shape, the fact that there appeared to be both a man and a woman involved, became the central piece of evidence investigators had to work with. And it simply wasn't enough. Despite an extensive, well-resourced investigation involving the FBI, no reliable lead ever emerged in the weeks and months that followed. J.C. Duguid had vanished from a public street, in broad daylight, in front of a witness who loved her, and investigators had almost nothing to go on beyond that. As the search stretched from weeks into months, and eventually into years, the case settled into the particular, agonizing category that the worst missing child cases occupy, neither closed nor advancing, a family left to wait indefinitely for news that might never come, while the rest of the country, inevitably, moved on to other headlines. The man in the car. The man responsible, though no one investigating the case knew it yet, was named Philip Garrido, a 50-year-old resident of Anch, California, roughly 140 miles from where J.C. had been taken. Garrido was not, in any sense, an unknown quantity to the justice system. In 1976, he had been convicted of kidnapping and raping a young woman, a crime committed in front of his own wife at the time, and had served 11 years in federal prison before being paroled in 1988, just 3 years before he and his second wife, Nancy, abducted J.C. from the side of the road in South Lake Tahoe. Garrido was, in other words, a known and registered sex offender, under active parole supervision, at the exact moment he committed one of the most notorious child abductions in modern American history. That fact alone would go on, 18 years later, to become one of the most scrutinized and criticized failures of the entire case, a question that would eventually cost the state of California dearly, both financially and in terms of public trust. What waited in Anch? What JC was taken to, though no one outside a small circle would know it for nearly 2 decades, was a concealed compound built into the backyard of the Garridos' modest home on Walnut Avenue in Anch, a labyrinth of tents, sheds, and a soundproofed outbuilding, hidden from the street and from casual view by fencing, trees, and, eventually, the sheer normalcy of a suburban property that no one had reason to look at twice. She would spend the next 18 years of her life there, hidden in plain sight less than 200 miles from the mother, stepfather, and sister who never stopped looking for her, and who had no way of knowing, for almost 2 full decades, whether she was even still alive. That's an almost unbearable thing to sit with. And it's where this story's real tension lives, not in a single dramatic night, the way many of the cases we've covered in this collection unfold, but in the sheer, grinding length of what came next. 18 years. Not months. Not a handful of years. 18 years of a childhood, and then an entire early adulthood, stolen and hidden away, while the world outside kept moving without her. In the chapters ahead, we're going to walk through how that captivity unfolded, how astonishingly close investigators came to finding her on more than one occasion without ever realizing it, and how, in the end, it wasn't a forensic breakthrough or a tip from the public that finally ended it. It was one campus police officer's simple, persistent instinct that something about a father and his 2 daughters, visiting a university campus on an ordinary afternoon in 2009, didn't quite add up. For 18 years, JC Duguid existed in a strange, terrible kind of limbo, alive, but entirely erased from the world she'd been taken from. To understand how that was possible for so long, in a suburban California neighborhood, surrounded by neighbors who had no idea, we have to look at both the physical space she was confined to and the system that repeatedly failed to notice what was happening right in front of it. A compound built for concealment. The backyard of the Garrido home on Walnut Avenue had been transformed, over the years, into something far more elaborate than an ordinary yard. Tucked behind fencing and overgrown vegetation, hidden from the street and largely from view even at the property line, was a small, improvised compound, multiple tents, 2 sheds, a rudimentary outhouse, and a soundproofed structure that Garrido had built specifically to keep sound from carrying beyond its walls. It was crude, in some respects, not a hidden bunker or an underground chamber, just ordinary backyard structures arranged in a way that kept anyone confined there almost entirely invisible to the outside world. And it worked, disturbingly well, for the better part of 2 decades. 2 searches that found nothing. What makes this case particularly difficult to process, in hindsight, is how many opportunities existed for it to end far sooner than it did, chances that, for one reason or another, simply slipped past. Law enforcement officers actually visited the Garrido property on at least 2 separate occasions during Jace's captivity, in 2006 and again in 2008, following up on unrelated reports and routine parole-related concerns. Neither visit uncovered the hidden backyard compound, despite officers being physically present on the property. The concealment was effective enough, and the searches evidently cursory enough, that JC remained undetected even with police standing in the same yard where she was being held. Beyond those direct visits, Garrido's status as a registered sex offender meant he was subject to ongoing parole supervision throughout this entire period, regular check-ins, home visits, and monitoring that, at least in theory, existed specifically to catch exactly this kind of ongoing danger. That system, too, repeatedly failed to identify what was happening. In one particularly damning detail that would later surface, a woman who reported concerning behavior involving Garrido had her complaint effectively dismissed by his supervising parole agent, who characterized the burden of closer monitoring as excessive given what he described, in his own case notes, as the complainant's apparent overreaction. A business and a family facade. Adding another layer of ordinary, functioning normalcy to the situation, Philip and Nancy Garrido operated a small printing business out of their home during much of this period, meaning clients and acquaintances periodically visited or interacted with the family, occasionally in ways that, in hindsight, raised small, unresolved questions nobody pursued far enough at the time. One client who worked with the couple's printing business later recalled, after the case became public, a passing exchange in which she'd asked one of the young girls living at the property about which church the family attended, a small, forgettable moment of curiosity that no one, including the woman asking it, had any reason at the time to treat as significant. Over the course of her captivity, Jacy gave birth to 2 daughters, fathered by Garrido, born when she was 14 and 17 years old. Both girls grew up largely within the same concealed environment, their existence essentially invisible to any official record or outside authority for years, a fact that would later become one of the most consequential threads in how the entire case finally unraveled. The years that didn't officially exist. For nearly 2 decades, then, an entire hidden family life unfolded steadily, almost undisturbed, mere miles from ordinary neighbors going about their daily routines. A captive woman raising 2 daughters conceived through repeated abuse, confined to a backyard compound that police had twice walked through without recognizing what they were looking at. It's a genuinely uncomfortable set of facts to sit with, and it's worth pausing on them rather than rushing past. This wasn't a case where the system had no opportunity to intervene. It had several. What finally broke the pattern, in the end, wasn't a routine inspection or a diligent parole check. It was something far more incidental, a university police officer's simple, persistent unease about a father and his 2 daughters showing up, unannounced, at a campus event application desk in the summer of 2009. Every long, unresolved case eventually turns on a small moment nobody could have predicted in advance. For the 18-year search for Jacy Dugard, that moment arrived on a university campus, on an ordinary weekday in late August of 2009, in the form of a father, his 2 daughters, and one campus police officer who simply couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. An application to host an event. On August 24, 2009, Philip Garrido visited the campus of the University of California, Berkeley, accompanied by 2 adolescent girls, seeking permission to hold a religious event on university grounds. He'd brought printed materials and pamphlets describing his beliefs, along with the 2 girls, presenting the visit as an ordinary logistical inquiry. There was nothing overtly alarming about the request itself, but something about the interaction, the girls' unusual, flattened effect, their apparent detachment from the ordinary rhythms of typical teenage behavior, the strange dynamic between them and the man accompanying them, struck the campus police officer handling the inquiry as genuinely off. It was, by most accounts, less a single specific red flag than an accumulation of small, hard-to-articulate details that simply didn't sit right. Rather than letting the encounter pass without follow-up, the officer ran a background check on Garrido. What came back stopped the process immediately. Philip Garrido was a registered sex offender, on active parole, with a conviction for kidnapping and rape already on his record. A call to a parole officer. Armed with that information, campus police contacted Garrido's supervising parole officer, Edward Santos Jr., to flag the concerning visit and the presence of the 2 girls, whose relationship to Garrido had never previously been disclosed or documented within his parole records. It was, in itself, an immediate and significant discrepancy, a man under close supervision, with children in his life that his own parole officer had no official knowledge of at all. Santos ordered Garrido to bring the girls to a scheduled parole office meeting 2 days later, on August 26th, not necessarily anticipating, at that point, that the meeting would unravel one of the country's longest-running missing person cases, but recognizing, at minimum, that the undisclosed children required an explanation. The meeting that changed everything. Garrido arrived at the parole office on August 26, 2009, with his wife Nancy, the 2 girls, and a 3rd young woman, an adult, though noticeably guarded and unwilling to offer much information about herself. When questioned, that 3rd woman initially gave a false name, introducing herself as Alyssa, and Garrido, for his part, described her to the parole officer as his niece. Investigators, already skeptical given the discrepancies already surfacing, continued pressing for more concrete answers. And slowly, over the course of that meeting, the fabricated story began to collapse. Garrido, according to accounts from those present, eventually confessed directly to his parole officer. He had kidnapped a girl in 1991, held her captive for the years since, and fathered children with her through repeated sexual assault. The woman calling herself Alyssa was, in fact, that girl, now 29 years old, and the mother of the two teenage daughters who had accompanied Garrido to the Berkeley campus 2 days earlier. It took additional time, and considerable gentle persistence from investigators, before the woman herself would confirm what Garrido had already admitted. She had spent so many years hidden away, controlled and psychologically isolated, that even in that moment of overdue rescue, she remained afraid to fully reveal who she actually was. Eventually, she did. Her name was Jacy Lee Jugad. She had been missing for 18 years, 2 months, and 16 days. An arrest, finally. Philip and Nancy Garrido were taken into custody that same day. What followed in the hours and days afterward was, for the family who had spent nearly 2 decades not knowing whether Jacy was alive, an almost incomprehensible whirlwind, a reunion nobody had allowed themselves to fully hope for, arriving after so many years that the search itself had, for much of the public, quietly faded into the category of cases presumed, sorrowfully, to never be resolved. The news broke nationally within hours, and the story that emerged over the following days and weeks, of a hidden backyard compound, of 2 searches that had missed her, of a system that had monitored her captor for years without ever detecting what was happening, would go on to become one of the most closely examined failures of parole supervision in recent American history. The moment Jacy Jugad confirmed her own identity to investigators on August 26, 2009, set off 2 parallel processes that would unfold over the following months and years: a deeply private, difficult family reunion, and a very public, very uncomfortable examination of exactly how the system meant to prevent this had failed so completely, for so long. Coming home, Jacy was reunited with her mother, Terry Probin, within days of her identity being confirmed, a reunion that, by every account from those close to the family, was overwhelming in ways that resist easy description. Terry had spent 18 years not knowing whether her daughter was alive, raising Jace's youngest sister in the shadow of an unresolved disappearance that never fully closed, never fully healed, and never fully went away. Now, suddenly, there was Jacy, 29 years old, a woman who had last been seen as an 11-year-old girl, accompanied by 2 daughters of her own, aged 11 and 15 at the time of the rescue, who had never known any life beyond the concealed compound where they'd been born and raised. The adjustment facing all of them was enormous, and it unfolded largely away from public view, at the family's request. Jacy, her mother, and her daughters worked to rebuild a relationship and a shared life essentially from scratch, aided by extensive therapeutic support, while navigating a level of public and media attention that made ordinary privacy almost impossible to come by. The legal reckoning. Philip and Nancy Garrido were formally charged with an extensive list of offenses, including kidnapping, rape, false imprisonment, and lewd conduct with a minor. They initially pleaded not guilty, but in April of 2011, both changed their pleas to guilty on the core charges, waiving their right to appeal as part of the arrangement. Philip Garrido was sentenced to 431 years to life in prison. Nancy Garrido, who had actively participated in the original abduction and the subsequent years of captivity, received a sentence of 36 years to life. Neither would ever be eligible for release. How the system failed. In the aftermath of Jace's rescue, intense scrutiny turned toward California's parole supervision system, which had monitored Philip Garrido continuously for years without ever detecting the hidden compound in his own backyard, despite at least 2 direct property visits by law enforcement during the years of her captivity. An independent review commissioned by the state identified a long list of specific supervisory failures, missed opportunities, inadequate follow-up, and a broader pattern of insufficient scrutiny applied to a man whose prior conviction should have warranted considerably closer monitoring than he actually received. The state of California ultimately settled a lawsuit brought on Jace's behalf for $20 million, a formal acknowledgement of the repeated institutional failures that had allowed her captivity to continue for as long as it did, even after investigators had, on more than one occasion, been physically present on the property where she was being held, building a new life. In the years following her rescue, JC made a deliberate choice that set her apart from many survivors of high-profile cases. Rather than retreating entirely from public life, she chose, on her own terms and in her own voice, to tell her own story. She published a memoir, A Stolen Life, in 2011, followed by a second book, Freedom, My Book of Firsts, chronicling her experience rebuilding a life and identity after 18 years of captivity. She also founded the JAYC Foundation, an organization dedicated to supporting families recovering from trauma, particularly those affected by abduction and long-term captivity, transforming her own experience, deliberately and publicly, into a resource for others facing similarly unimaginable circumstances. What set this case apart? Among the cases in this collection, this one occupies a genuinely distinct place. It isn't a story about a killer being caught, or a mystery finally solved after a body was found. It's a story about survival across an almost unfathomable span of time, and about a rescue that arrived not through forensic breakthrough or diligent investigation, but through the accumulated instinct of a single officer who simply couldn't let a strange, uneasy feeling go unexamined. That distinction matters. It's a reminder that not every resolution in these stories comes from cracking a code or matching a fingerprint. Sometimes it comes down to someone, somewhere, refusing to dismiss a detail that felt wrong, even when there was no obvious reason yet to think it mattered. Beyond the individual failures of Philip Garrido's specific parole officer, JC Jugad's case forced a much broader, national conversation about how sex offender monitoring actually functions in practice, a conversation that outlasted the initial shock of her rescue by years, and that continues to shape policy discussions today. A system built on paperwork, not vigilance. The independent review commissioned in the aftermath of Jace's rescue painted a troubling picture of what parole supervision for high-risk offenders actually looked like in practice during the 1990s and 2000s. Garrido's status as a convicted kidnapper and rapist should have, in theory, triggered heightened scrutiny throughout his parole period. In practice, oversight relied heavily on scheduled check-ins and surface-level compliance, rather than the kind of thorough, proactive investigation that might have uncovered a concealed backyard compound holding a woman and 2 children who existed, officially, nowhere in any government record. The 2 property visits conducted in 2006 and 2008 became particular focal points of criticism. Officers had been physically present on the Garrido property during both visits, yet neither uncovered the hidden compound just steps away, raising uncomfortable questions about how thoroughly those visits had actually been conducted, and what specific protocols, if followed more rigorously, might have changed the outcome years earlier than 2009. The complaint that was dismissed. Perhaps the most damning single detail to emerge from the post-rescue review involved a formal complaint made years before Jace's rescue by a woman who had raised concerns about Garrido's behavior and access to children. Rather than triggering closer scrutiny, her concerns were effectively set aside by the supervising parole agent handling the case, who characterized more intensive monitoring as an unnecessary burden given what he described, in his own case documentation, as an overreaction on the complainant's part. That single dismissed complaint became, in the years of policy analysis that followed, a frequently cited example of exactly the kind of institutional failure the case as a whole represented, a system that had been given a specific, actionable warning sign, and had chosen not to act on it with the seriousness it deserved. Policy changes that followed. In the years after Jace's rescue, California implemented a range of reforms aimed at strengthening supervision protocols for high-risk sex offenders, including changes to how home visits were conducted, increased training requirements for supervising officers, and revised standards for evaluating and responding to complaints or reports of concerning behavior involving registered offenders. The case also contributed to broader, national conversations about GPS monitoring requirements for high-risk offenders, victim notification systems, and the specific vulnerabilities in interagency communication that had allowed Garrido's undisclosed children to go unnoticed by his supervising officer for so many years, despite regular scheduled contact throughout his parole period. A case still used as a cautionary example. More than 15 years later, J.C. Jugad's case remains a frequently referenced example in discussions of sex offender monitoring policy, cited by advocates, legislators, and criminal justice researchers examining the gap between formal supervisory requirements on paper and their actual, inconsistent enforcement in practice. It's a sobering thread to follow, precisely because the failures involved weren't exotic or unprecedented. They were mundane, bureaucratic, the kind of overlooked details and dismissed complaints that can occur in any oversight system stretched thin across too many cases with too few resources. That mundane quality is, in some ways, what makes the case's 18-year span so difficult to fully process. It wasn't a single dramatic failure. It was years of small, accumulated ones. In the chapters ahead, we'll shift from the systemic failures that allowed this case to continue for as long as it did, toward Jace's own remarkable path afterward, rebuilding a life, an identity, and a public voice on her own terms. Decades after that voice had been taken from her on a quiet mountain road in 1991. For most of the survivors we've discussed across this collection of stories, life after a case's resolution unfolds quietly, out of public view, and understandably so. J.C. Jugad's path took a different shape, not because the trauma she carried was any less profound, but because she made a deliberate, considered choice to speak about her experience in her own words, on her own timeline, rather than leaving her story to be told entirely by others. Writing A Stolen Life. In 2011, less than 2 years after her rescue, J.C. published her first memoir, A Stolen Life. The book offered an account of her abduction and the years that followed, written in her own voice rather than filtered through journalists, documentarians, or court proceedings. It became a bestseller almost immediately, resonating with readers not primarily because of its subject matter's shock value, but because of the clarity and steadiness with which J.C. described her own experience and her process of reclaiming a sense of self after so many years of having that self systematically suppressed. She followed it, several years later, with a second book, Freedom, My Book of Firsts, a work focused less on the captivity itself and more on the specific, sometimes overwhelming experience of encountering ordinary life for the first time as an adult, learning to navigate everyday tasks, technology, and social interaction that had simply never been part of her world during the 18 years she'd spent hidden away, choosing visibility on her own terms. What distinguishes Jace's public path from many others in similarly extreme circumstances is the degree of control she exercised over how, when, and how much of her story she chose to share. She participated in select interviews and documentary projects, but consistently on terms she and her family negotiated carefully, prioritizing her own well-being and that of her daughters over the broader public's appetite for detail. This measured approach reflected something therapists and advocates working with trauma survivors often emphasize, that reclaiming agency, deciding for oneself what to share, and when, after years of having every choice taken away, can itself be a meaningful part of recovery, distinct from the content of what's eventually shared. The JAYC Foundation. Beyond her writing, J.C. channeled her experience into direct advocacy work, founding the JAYC Foundation in the years following her rescue. The organization's mission centers on supporting families recovering from trauma related to abduction and recovery, offering resources aimed at the kind of long-term psychological and practical rebuilding that J.C. and her own family had to navigate largely without an established roadmap, given how unusual the length and specifics of her captivity had been. The Foundation's work reflects a broader pattern common among survivors of extreme, prolonged trauma who go on to become advocates, transforming an experience that could easily remain purely a source of private pain into something that actively helps others facing related circumstances, even if considerably less extreme in scope. Raising 2 daughters born into captivity. Perhaps the most complex and least publicly discussed dimension of Jace's life after 2009 involves her 2 daughters, both born during her captivity and both raised, for the entirety of their early childhoods, within the concealed compound in the Garrido's backyard. Their transition into the wider world after 2009 required its own extensive process of adjustment and support, layered atop the specific complexities of processing exactly how they came to exist and the circumstances of their early years. The family has, by design, kept most specifics of the daughters' individual lives private in the years since, a choice consistent with the broader pattern of controlled, deliberate visibility that has defined how JC has approached her public story throughout. A different kind of ending, where many of the cases in this collection end with a verdict, a sentence, or an unresolved question that continues generating debate for years afterward. This one ends somewhat different, with a woman who spent 18 years having her identity, autonomy, and voice systematically taken from her, choosing, deliberately and on her own terms, to reclaim all three. That's a meaningfully different kind of resolution than most true crime stories offer. Not a puzzle solved, but a life, however altered and however much was lost along the way, actively being rebuilt. Every story in this collection has, by now, taught us something a little different about how justice, memory, and resolution actually work in cases like these. This one, more than most, leaves us with a question that doesn't resolve neatly. What does it actually mean to give someone back 18 stolen years? A sentence that can't undo the sentence already served. Philip Garrido will spend the rest of his life in prison. Nancy Garrido will as well. Their sentences were, by any measure, severe, appropriately so, given the scale and duration of what they inflicted. But it's worth sitting honestly with the difficult truth underlying every case of this kind. No sentence, however long, restores what was actually taken. JC didn't get her childhood back. Her mother and sister didn't get the 18 years of an ordinary, present relationship back. The legal system did what it could. It removed two dangerous people from society permanently, and it formally acknowledged, through the state's $20 million settlement, that institutional failures had allowed their crimes to continue for far longer than they should have. But acknowledgement and restitution, however meaningful, aren't the same as undoing harm. The uncomfortable lesson about vigilance. If this case leaves behind a lasting, practical lesson, it's an uncomfortable one. The systems meant to catch exactly this kind of danger existed, on paper, the entire time JC was held captive. A parole system, scheduled home visits, a formal complaint process. None of it worked, not because the concept was flawed, but because execution, again and again, fell short. A supervising officer who dismissed a warning sign, property visits that missed what was hidden in plain sight, years of monitoring that amounted, in practice, to considerably less scrutiny than Garrido's history warranted. It's a pattern worth remembering, not to assign blame retroactively to individuals doing difficult jobs with limited resources, but because it points toward something true about institutional safety more broadly. The existence of a system isn't the same as that system actually functioning as intended. Real vigilance requires more than a checklist. It requires people willing to take small, hard-to-articulate discomfort seriously, the way that one campus police officer did, on an ordinary afternoon in August of 2009, when something about a father and his two daughters simply didn't sit right, and she decided to act on that feeling rather than let it pass. What survival actually looked like. It's tempting, telling a story like this one, to end on the rescue itself, the parole office, the confession, the reunion, as though that moment resolved everything that came after it. It didn't. And it's worth being honest about that rather than wrapping this story in a bow it doesn't fully earn. What came after the rescue was years of difficult, ongoing work, therapy, relationship rebuilding, learning to navigate a world that had changed enormously in the 18 years JC had been removed from it, and raising two daughters who'd never known anything but the compound they'd been born into. That JC chose, through all of that, to eventually write her own account, build a foundation supporting other trauma survivors, and construct a life genuinely her own. That's not a footnote to this story. It's arguably the most important part of it, and the part most true crime retellings, focused naturally on the drama of the crime and the rescue itself, tend to underweight. That brings us to the end of this story. A silver car on a quiet mountain road. 18 years hidden behind ordinary suburban fencing, missed twice by investigators standing on the very property where she was held. A campus police officer's unwillingness to let an uneasy feeling go unexamined. A confession, a reunion, and a reckoning with exactly how a system built to prevent this had failed, repeatedly, for nearly 2 decades. And, finally, a woman who took what remained of her own story back, in her own words, on her own terms. Story 3. Moscow, Idaho is not the kind of place true crime stories usually happen. It's a small university town, population under 26,000, the kind of place where the local police department goes years without handling a single homicide. In fact, before November of 2022, Moscow hadn't seen a murder since 2015. That changed in the early morning hours of November 13, 2022, inside a rented house on King Road, less than half a mile from the University of Idaho campus. A crime so sudden, so specific, and so seemingly motiveless that it would take investigators 7 weeks, a genetic genealogy team, and a discarded Q-tip from a trash can 3,000 miles away to finally answer the only question anyone in Moscow really wanted answered. Who did this, and why? An ordinary college weekend. The night before the murders unfolded the way countless Saturday nights do in a college town. 2 of the home's residents, 21-year-old roommates and lifelong best friends Madison Mogen and Kaylee Gonsalves, had gone out that evening, moving between a local bar and a food truck before returning home in the early morning hours. Also staying at the house that night was 20-year-old Zaina Kernadal, another roommate, along with her boyfriend, 20-year-old Ethan Chapin, a fellow University of Idaho student who was a frequent overnight guest. 2 other roommates were also home that night, in separate bedrooms on a different floor of the house, details that would later become central to the case, because both would survive the attack that took place just steps away, apparently without fully understanding, in the moment, the scale of what was happening inside their own home. What was found the next afternoon? The bodies of all 4 victims, Mogen, Gonsalves, Kernadal, and Chapin, were discovered the following afternoon, when friends who hadn't been able to reach anyone in the house grew concerned enough to go check in person. What they found prompted an immediate 911 call and the beginning of an investigation that would, within days, become one of the most closely watched unsolved murder cases in the country. All 4 victims had been stabbed to death. There were no signs of forced entry into the house, a detail investigators would spend considerable time trying to explain, since it suggested either that the door had been left unlocked, or that whoever came inside that night had some other means of entry that didn't require breaking anything to get in. No murder weapon was recovered at the scene, though investigators would later determine, based on physical evidence, that it was likely a large, fixed-blade knife. A town in shock, a department out of its depth. For Moscow police, a department accustomed to handling the ordinary business of a small college town, the scale and brutality of what they were now investigating was almost entirely unprecedented. Within days, the Moscow Police Department made the decision to bring in outside assistance, including the Idaho State Police and, eventually, the FBI, a level of resourcing rarely required for a town of this size, but one that reflected just how far beyond local capacity this case had already moved. Publicly, investigators offered very little in the way of concrete information in the early days of the investigation, a silence that, understandably, did little to ease the mounting fear spreading through a town suddenly grappling with the reality that whoever had done this remained entirely unidentified and unaccounted for. Students at the University of Idaho, many of whom lived in similarly unlocked, casually secured off-campus housing throughout the town, found themselves confronting an unfamiliar and unwelcome new anxiety. Installing locks, avoiding walking alone at night, and watching a tight-knit college community transform, almost overnight, into a place actively afraid of an unknown threat still walking free among them. Thousands of tips poured into investigators over the following weeks. None of them, for a long, agonizing stretch, produced anything resembling a breakthrough. What eventually cracked the case wasn't a witness, or a confession, or a lucky break from the volume of public tips. It was a single item left behind at the scene, a detail investigators would keep almost entirely out of public view for weeks, precisely because of how much it would eventually matter. For the first several weeks after the murders, Moscow police revealed almost nothing publicly about the physical evidence they'd recovered from the King Road house, a silence that frustrated a community desperate for answers, but one that turned out to be deliberate, protecting the single most important piece of evidence in the entire case. What was left behind? At the crime scene, investigators recovered a leather knife sheath found near one of the victims. It would take weeks of forensic work before this single item became the thread that unraveled the entire case. But from very early on, investigators understood its significance. Touch DNA, a small but often sufficient genetic sample transferred through simple skin contact, had been left on the sheath's snap closure, and forensic analysts began working to extract a usable profile from it almost immediately. The knife itself, believed by investigators to be a large, fixed-blade weapon, was never recovered, likely taken from the scene by whoever had used it. But the sheath, left behind either by mistake or in haste, gave investigators something that would prove to be the single most decisive piece of evidence in the entire case. Surviving witnesses. 2 of the home's residents survived that night, having been present elsewhere in the house during the attack. In the weeks that followed, investigators worked carefully and patiently to piece together what those surviving roommates could recall, a process complicated significantly by the trauma of the night itself, and by the genuine uncertainty, in the moment, about exactly what they had witnessed or heard. Court documents later revealed that one of the surviving roommates recalled seeing an unfamiliar figure inside the house in the early morning hours, a man she didn't recognize, wearing dark clothing, with bushy eyebrows visible above a mask, moving through a hallway before leaving through a back door. It was a genuinely harrowing account, and one investigators treated carefully, aware that eyewitness recollections from survivors of extreme trauma, however sincere, can be limited or affected by the circumstances under which they were formed. A cow on surveillance footage. Alongside the DNA evidence developing from the knife sheath, investigators pursued a second, parallel thread: surveillance camera footage from homes and businesses in the King Road neighborhood, reviewed methodically in the hopes of identifying any vehicle or individual whose movements that night didn't fit the ordinary pattern of a quiet Saturday. That review eventually identified a white sedan, later determined to be a Hyundai Elantra, that had been recorded passing the King Road house multiple times in the hours surrounding the murders. Behavior investigators considered consistent with someone either surveilling the property in advance or repeatedly circling the area that night. Determining the exact make and model took considerable forensic video analysis, given the limited resolution and angle of the available footage, but investigators eventually felt confident enough in the identification to begin searching for a matching vehicle registered in the surrounding region. 2 threads, slowly converging. By December of 2022, roughly a month after the murders, investigators had 2 significant, independent leads developing in parallel: a genetic profile extracted from the knife sheath, distinct enough to potentially identify a specific individual once compared against available genetic databases, and a specific vehicle, a white Hyundai Elantra, that surveillance footage placed at the scene multiple times on the night of the killings. Neither lead, on its own, had yet produced a name, but investigators were converging, patiently and methodically, on the same answer from 2 entirely different directions, a process that would soon lead them roughly 2,500 miles away, to a graduate criminology program at Washington State University, just 8 miles from the crime scene itself, and eventually, to a house in eastern Pennsylvania where a young man matching an unsettling number of the case's emerging details was living with his parents over winter break. There's a detail about this case that struck almost everyone who followed it as uncomfortably ironic, once it finally emerged. The man investigators were closing in on wasn't a stranger to the machinery of criminal investigation. He was a PhD student in criminology, studying the psychology of crime at a university just 8 miles from where the murders took place. A student of crime, not far away. Brian Coburgo, 28 years old at the time of the murders, was a doctoral student at Washington State University in Pullman, Washington, close enough to Moscow, Idaho that the 2 college towns essentially function as a shared community, separated by little more than a short drive across the state line. Coburgo was pursuing a degree specifically focused on criminology, having previously completed a master's program in the same field. That academic background became, once his name surfaced as a suspect, one of the case's most widely discussed and debated details, fueling extensive public speculation about whether his study of criminal behavior and investigative technique might have informed how the crime was carried out, including the apparent absence of forced entry and the limited physical evidence left behind at the scene. Investigators and prosecutors, for their part, would ultimately build their case on the physical and digital evidence they'd gathered, rather than on theories about his academic interests. But the coincidence remained a persistent thread throughout public discussion of the case. The Elantra, the surveillance-derived vehicle description, a white Hyundai Elantra, spotted repeatedly near the King Road house on the night of the murders, became one of investigators' most productive leads once they began cross-referencing vehicle registration records in the region. Officers at Washington State University independently identified a white Elantra registered to a graduate student living in off-campus housing, Brian Cobogo. It was, on its own, circumstantial. A common vehicle model, in a college town full of students, doesn't automatically implicate anyone. But combined with the developing genetic evidence from the knife sheath, and further investigative work examining Cobogo's cell phone data, which court documents later indicated placed his phone near the King Road house on multiple occasions in the weeks before the murders, and showed unusual patterns of activity on the night itself, investigators began to feel they were closing in on their answer. Winter break and a long drive east. In mid-December of 2022, roughly a month after the murders, Cobogo left Washington and drove across the country to his parents' home in Chestnut Hill Township, Pennsylvania, for winter break, a routine, unremarkable trip on its surface, but one that placed him, and the vehicle investigators had been tracking, thousands of miles away from the jurisdiction actively building a case against him. Rather than treating this as an obstacle, investigators used the distance to their advantage. Working discreetly, and without alerting Cobogo to the extent of their suspicion, law enforcement began surveillance of the Pennsylvania property, watching for an opportunity to obtain a direct DNA sample they could compare against the genetic profile recovered from the knife sheath, without yet having enough for a formal arrest. Trash day in Pennsylvania. The opportunity came in a form that, once it became public, struck many observers as almost anticlimactic given the scale and gravity of the case. Investigators recovered discarded items from the trash outside the Cobogo family home, including a Q-tip. Laboratory analysis of the genetic material recovered from that discarded item determined it belonged to the biological father of the same individual whose DNA had been recovered from the knife sheath at the crime scene. A familial match precise enough to all but confirm what investigators had suspected for weeks. It was a technique that echoed, in its basic logic, the genetic genealogy breakthrough that had cracked the Golden State Killer case years earlier, working outward from partial or familial genetic matches to close in on a specific individual, rather than requiring a direct match already sitting in a criminal database. With that confirmation in hand, investigators had what they needed. On December 30th, 2022, 4 to 7 days after the murders, Brian Cobogo was arrested at his parents' Pennsylvania home, roughly 2,500 miles from the King Road house in Moscow, Idaho. Brian Cobogo's arrest on December 30th, 2022, closed the active manhunt phase of this case, but it opened something almost as prolonged and complicated, a 2.5-year legal process that would win through pretrial motions, contested evidence hearings, a change of venue, and a death penalty designation before ever reaching a resolution. Brought back to Idaho, Cobogo waived extradition proceedings in Pennsylvania relatively quickly, and was transported back to Idaho to face formal charges. In May of 2023, a Latta County grand jury formally indicted him on 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of felony burglary, the burglary charge tied to the unlawful entry into the King Road house itself. The charges carried the possibility of the death penalty, a fact that shaped nearly every subsequent stage of the legal process, since capital cases in the United States typically involve significantly more extensive pretrial procedure, evidentiary review, and appellate safeguards than non-capital prosecutions. A defense built on challenging the evidence. Cobogo's defense team spent much of the following 2 years mounting an aggressive series of challenges aimed at the prosecution's core evidence, particularly the DNA analysis connecting him to the knife sheath recovered at the scene. and the genetic genealogy techniques investigators had used to identify him as a suspect in the first place. Defense attorneys sought to have this evidence excluded entirely, arguing procedural and scientific concerns about how the genetic genealogy search had been conducted and how the resulting DNA match had subsequently been verified. They also pursued what's known as a Frank's hearing, a specific legal mechanism allowing a defense team to challenge the validity of the information law enforcement used to obtain their original search warrants, essentially arguing that if the underlying warrant application contained misleading or insufficient information, evidence gathered as a result should be thrown out. Judge Stephen Hippler, who took over presiding duties in the case, denied both the effort to exclude the DNA evidence and the request for a Frank's hearing, allowing the prosecution's central forensic evidence to remain admissible heading toward trial. A change of venue. Given the intensity of local media coverage and the deep personal impact the case had on the small Moscow community, Koboga's defense team also successfully argued that finding an unbiased jury within the immediate area would be extraordinarily difficult. The trial was ultimately relocated roughly 300 miles away, from Lata County to Boise, in Ada County, a shift intended to draw from a jury pool with somewhat greater distance, both geographically and emotionally, from the immediate community most directly affected by the murders. Building toward trial. By October of 2024, with pre-trial motions largely resolved, the court set a trial date for August 11, 2025, with proceedings expected to run for approximately 3 months, including a separate penalty phase if Koboga were convicted on the capital charges. Prosecutors, in preparation for trial, worked with the FBI to construct a detailed three-dimensional digital model of the King Road house, intended to help witnesses testify clearly about the layout and sequence of events inside the home on the night of the murders. For the victims' families, and for the broader public that had followed the case closely since November of 2022, the approaching trial represented the culmination of nearly 3 years of waiting, the point at which the extensive body of DNA evidence, cell phone data, and surveillance footage investigators had assembled would finally be presented, tested, and argued in open court. That trial never happened the way anyone expected. In the final weeks before jury selection was set to begin, Brian Koboga did something that surprised nearly everyone following the case, reversing course after nearly 3 years of contesting every piece of evidence against him. For nearly 3 years, Brian Koboga's defense team fought this case on almost every conceivable front, challenging the DNA evidence, the search warrants, the venue, the death penalty itself. Then, with jury selection just weeks away and a trial expected to consume the better part of 3 months, that resistance ended abruptly. A plea deal, days before trial. On June 30th, 2025, with an August trial date rapidly approaching, Koboga accepted a plea agreement offered by prosecutors. Under its terms, prosecutors agreed to drop the death penalty in exchange for Koboga pleading guilty to all charges, 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of felony burglary. The agreement required him to accept a sentence of life in prison without any possibility of parole, and to formally waive his right to appeal the conviction. For a case that had, until that point, been defined by an aggressive, unyielding defense strategy focused on excluding key evidence and preserving every possible legal avenue, the sudden shift toward a guilty plea represented a significant and, for many following the case, unexpected turn. A formal change of plea. The formal hearing to enter the new plea took place on July 2, 2025, before Judge Stephen Hippler in Boise. In a moment that finally, after nearly 3 years without any public acknowledgement of guilt, gave the case a measure of direct confirmation, Koboga spoke in court, answering the judge's questions in brief, unelaborated responses. When asked directly whether he had killed each of the 4 victims, Koboga answered yes for each name. When asked how he pleaded to the charges against him, he answered guilty. Beyond those minimal, required responses, he offered no further explanation, no expression of remorse, and critically, no indication of what had actually motivated the killings, a silence that would remain one of the case's most painful, unresolved elements even after his formal admission of guilt. A mixed reaction from the families. The plea deal did not land as a uniformly welcome resolution among the victims' families, several of whom had spent nearly 3 years anticipating a full public trial, a process many hoped would force a complete accounting of the evidence, and potentially some explanation of motive, in open court. Steve Gonsalves, Kaylee Gonsalves's father, was notably critical of the arrangement in the days following the announcement, describing it in blunt terms as far short of genuine justice and expressing frustration that the deal had been reached without what he characterized as sufficient input or agreement from the families most directly affected by the case's outcome. Other family members expressed more measured, if still complicated, reactions, acknowledging that the plea deal guaranteed a conviction and a permanent sentence without the uncertainty, however small, that any jury trial inherently carries, while also recognizing that it foreclosed the fuller public accounting many had hoped a trial might eventually provide. Why prosecutors chose the deal? For prosecutors, the decision to offer a plea agreement rather than proceed to trial reflected a familiar calculation in capital cases: a guaranteed conviction and permanent sentence, achieved without the substantial risk, expense, and multi-year appellate process that capital convictions typically generate, against the possibility, however remote given the strength of the DNA evidence, of an acquittal or a prolonged appeals battle that could stretch on for years or even decades beyond an initial guilty verdict. Larter County Prosecutor Bill Thompson, addressing reporters after the case concluded, noted that despite the extensive investigation, there had been no evidence uncovered suggesting Kobergo had any prior history of violence or a criminal record before the murders, a detail that, rather than offering any explanatory comfort, only deepened the case's central, unanswered mystery: why an ordinary, previously unremarkable criminology graduate student would carry out something this violent, seemingly without warning or precedent. That unanswered question, motive, the one thing the plea deal never required Kobergo to explain, would carry directly into his formal sentencing hearing 3 weeks later, a hearing that would give the victims' families their first, and likely only, opportunity to address him directly. On July 23, 2025, nearly 3 years after 4 young lives ended in a house on King Road, Brian Kobergo stood before Judge Stephen Hiplow in a Boise courtroom to receive his formal sentence, and to hear, for the first time, directly from the families whose lives his actions had permanently altered. A room full of grief. The sentencing hearing stretched across several emotional hours, as friends and family members of Madison Mogen, Kaylee Gonsalves, Zaina Kernadal, and Ethan Chapin were given the opportunity to address Kobergo directly, a chance, for many of them, to finally say what nearly 3 years of legal proceedings had never allowed them to say in his presence. The surviving roommates, who had lived through the night of the murders and carried the trauma of it in the years since, described the ongoing anxiety and fear that had reshaped their daily lives, the difficulty of trusting a sense of safety in their own homes, the weight of having survived a night that took the lives of close friends just steps away. Olivia Gonsalves, Kaylee's sister, delivered one of the hearing's most forceful statements, addressing Kobergo with unflinching directness and describing him, in blunt terms, as a sociopath, psychopath, murderer. Her words captured a sentiment shared, in varying forms, by nearly everyone who spoke that day, a desire not just for a legal sentence, but for Kobergo to sit and listen, finally, to the full weight of what his actions had done to the people left behind. ABC News. Silence, even at the end. Throughout the hearing, Kobergo showed almost no visible reaction to the statements being made against him, a demeanor consistent with how he had conducted himself throughout the entirety of the legal proceedings, from his initial arrest through his eventual guilty plea. When Judge Hipler offered him the opportunity to speak before sentencing, Kobergo declined. It was, for many of the families present, a deeply unsatisfying final note to nearly 3 years of waiting. They had gathered, in some cases, hoping for an explanation, some acknowledgement of motive, some window into why an ordinary graduate student with no documented history of violence had done what he did. Kobergo offered nothing. Prosecutor Bill Thompson, addressing reporters afterward, confirmed plainly that the families remained, even after sentencing, entirely in the dark about his motive, a mystery the plea agreement had never required him to resolve. The formal sentence. Judge Hippler formally sentenced Coburgo to 4 consecutive terms of life in prison without the possibility of parole, one for each of the murder victims, along with an additional 10-year sentence for the burglary charge and financial penalties totaling roughly $290,000 payable to the victims' families. Combined with the appeal waiver built into his original plea agreement, the sentence was designed to ensure Coburgo would spend the remainder of his life in prison, with no realistic legal path toward release. A case formally closed, but not fully resolved. In the narrowest legal sense, the case concluded that day, a conviction secured, a sentence handed down, an appeal formally waived. But for the families who had spent nearly 3 years anticipating a trial that might have provided a fuller public accounting of the evidence and, they hoped, some insight into motive, the sentencing hearing closed the legal chapter of this story while leaving its most human question exactly where it had been since November of 2022, unanswered. That tension, a case legally resolved but emotionally unfinished, would resurface again in an unexpected way roughly a year later, when new developments emerged that reopened parts of the case many had assumed were permanently settled. For nearly a year after his sentencing, the Coburgo case appeared, to most observers, to be as fully closed as a criminal case can be. A guilty plea entered, a sentence served, an appeal formally waived as part of the agreement that had spared him the death penalty. Then, in the months that followed, that assumption of finality began to unravel in an unexpected way. A waiver, challenged. Despite having explicitly waived his right to appeal as a condition of his plea agreement, Coburgo's legal team filed for post-conviction relief in June of 2026, a separate legal mechanism from a standard appeal, typically used to challenge a conviction on grounds such as ineffective legal counsel, newly discovered evidence, or constitutional violations that weren't, or couldn't have been, addressed during the original proceedings. Alongside that filing, reports emerged that Coburgo was separately seeking to withdraw his guilty plea entirely, an unusual and legally difficult path, given that plea withdrawals after sentencing face a significantly higher legal bar than pre-sentencing withdrawal requests, and given that his original agreement had included an explicit waiver of appellate rights specifically in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. Timing that raised eyebrows. The renewed legal activity drew particular scrutiny because of its timing, surfacing in the run-up to the premiere of a documentary examining the case in detail. For a case that had already generated an extraordinary volume of public fascination, true crime podcasts, television specials, and extensive ongoing news coverage, the coincidence of renewed legal filings arriving alongside a major media release struck many observers, including some of the victims' families, as difficult to view as entirely unrelated. Legal analysts covering the development noted that Coburgo's path to actually overturning his conviction or reopening his case faced substantial obstacles, given both the strength of the original DNA evidence and the explicit terms of the plea agreement he had voluntarily entered into a year earlier, with the advice of experienced defense counsel and full awareness of what he was giving up in exchange for avoiding capital punishment. What this meant for the families. For the families of Mogen, Gonsalves, Kernadal, and Chapin, news of the post-conviction filing reopened wounds many had hoped, however cautiously, might finally be allowed to begin healing after the sentencing hearing the previous summer. The prospect of renewed legal proceedings, however unlikely to ultimately succeed, meant confronting, once again, the possibility of Coburgo's case remaining an active, unresolved presence in their lives well beyond the conviction and sentence they'd already endured nearly 3 years of waiting to see finalized. It's a pattern that echoes, in some respects, other cases in this collection. Scott Peterson's ongoing innocence claim decades after his conviction, or the years of appeals that eventually reshaped his death sentence into a life sentence. Even a guilty plea, entered directly and unambiguously in open court, doesn't always guarantee the kind of permanent legal closure it appears to promise in the moment it's given. As of this telling, the post-conviction proceedings remain unresolved, working their way through the same Idaho court system that handled the original case, a reminder that even cases built on overwhelming physical evidence and a direct admission of guilt can continue generating legal activity and renewed pain for the families involved, for years after the moment that felt, at the time, like a conclusion. Beyond the human drama of the investigation, arrest, and eventual guilty plea, the Kobogo case represents something significant in the broader evolution of criminal forensics, a high-profile demonstration of genetic genealogy techniques being applied swiftly, in an active investigation, to identify a suspect within weeks rather than decades. A newer application of a familiar technique. The genetic genealogy method used to identify Kobogo traces its origins directly back to the Golden State Killer investigation years earlier. The same basic approach of using crime scene DNA to search genealogy databases for genetic relatives, then working outward through family trees to identify a specific individual. What made the Kobogo case notably different was the speed of its application. Where the Golden State Killer investigation took months of painstaking genealogical research, spanning multiple family trees and reaching back generations, investigators in the Kobogo case moved from crime scene DNA to a confirmed suspect in a matter of weeks, reflecting how significantly the underlying technology and investigative expertise had matured in the years between the two cases. The confirmation method, too, echoed earlier cases in this collection while adding its own distinct wrinkle. Rather than obtaining a discarded sample directly from the suspect, as investigators had done with Joseph DeAngelo's car door handle in the Golden State Killer case, Kobogo investigators worked from discarded material collected at his parents' home in Pennsylvania, using a familial DNA match, identifying his father as the likely genetic relative of whoever had left DNA on the knife sheath, to build enough confidence for an arrest before a direct comparison sample was ultimately obtained. Digital evidence as a parallel thread. Alongside the genetic evidence, the Kobogo case highlighted how significantly cell phone location data and digital forensics have become central tools in modern criminal investigation. Court documents indicated that Kobogo's phone had been in the vicinity of the King Road house on numerous occasions in the weeks leading up to the murders, and that its activity pattern on the night of the killings itself was notably unusual compared to his typical usage. This kind of digital trail, largely invisible to a suspect going about ordinary daily life, generated passively simply by carrying a phone, has become, in the years since cases like this one, an increasingly routine and often decisive component of criminal investigations, supplementing traditional physical evidence with a detailed record of movement and behavior that didn't exist in comparable form even a decade or two earlier. A case study in rapid modern investigation. Taken together, the DNA evidence, the vehicle identification through surveillance footage analysis, and the cell phone data represent a kind of forensic convergence increasingly common in contemporary criminal cases, multiple independent technological threads, each individually persuasive, combining to build a case with a speed that would have been unimaginable in many of the older cases covered elsewhere in this collection. It's worth noting, too, how this technological capability intersects with the ethical and privacy questions raised earlier in our discussion of the Golden State Killer case. The same tools that allowed investigators to identify Kobogo within weeks rely on genetic and digital data that ordinary people generate and share, often without fully considering how it might someday be used in a criminal investigation involving someone else entirely. That tension between the genuine public safety value of these techniques and the privacy questions they raise remains very much unresolved, even as the tools themselves continue to grow more capable and more central to how difficult cases get solved. Of everything this case left behind, a conviction, 4 life sentences, a technical demonstration of how far forensic genetics had advanced. The single detail that continued to unsettle people most was the one thing that never got resolved. Nobody, including Brian Kobogo himself, ever offered a clear explanation for why this happened. An absence, not a mystery novel twist. It's worth being careful and honest about this, rather than treating the absence of a stated motive as an invitation to speculate freely. Prosecutor Bill Thompson stated plainly, after the case concluded, that investigators found no evidence Kobogo had any documented history of violence or prior criminal record before the murders. That absence of a discernible warning sign is, in some ways, more unsettling than a clear pattern of prior escalation would have been. It offers no obvious explanatory thread for the public, the families, or even investigators to hold on to. Koboga's own courtroom statements, both during his guilty plea and at sentencing, gave almost nothing away. He confirmed, in single-word answers, that he had committed the murders. He declined every opportunity, at every subsequent hearing, to explain why. That silence was, by all accounts, deliberate and consistent, extending even to his own defense team, who reportedly had limited insight into his reasoning beyond what became necessary for their legal strategy. What the public debated anyway. In the absence of any confirmed motive, public discussion of the case, across news coverage, podcasts, and true crime communities, inevitably filled the vacuum with theory and speculation. Much of this centered on Koboga's academic background in criminology, with many wondering whether his study of criminal psychology and investigative technique had shaped how he approached the crime itself, including the apparent lack of forced entry and the limited physical evidence recovered from the scene. It's important to treat this kind of speculation carefully. A graduate degree in criminology doesn't, on its own, explain or predict violent behavior, and the overwhelming majority of people who study criminology professionally never commit any crime at all. Prosecutors, notably, built their case entirely on physical and digital evidence rather than psychological theorizing about Koboga's academic interests, and no official account of the case has ever confirmed a specific motive grounded in that background. Living with an unanswered question. For the families of Madison Mogen, Kaylee Gonsalves, Zaina Kernadal, and Ethan Chapin, the absence of a clear motive represents one of the more difficult, ongoing aspects of processing this case. Many survivors of violent crime describe a specific kind of psychological need to understand why something happened, not necessarily to excuse it, but to make sense of a senseless event, to locate some kind of internal logic that might make an incomprehensible act feel, even slightly, more comprehensible. Koboga's guilty plea provided legal resolution without providing that. The families got a conviction. They got a permanent sentence. They did not get an explanation, and given his waiver of appeal rights and his consistent silence throughout every subsequent proceeding, it remains genuinely uncertain whether they ever will. That's an uncomfortable place to leave a story, and it's one we've encountered before in this collection. The Casey Anthony case left its central question of what actually happened unresolved despite a full trial. This case leaves the question of why unresolved despite a full confession. Some cases, it turns out, can be legally closed without ever being fully, humanly understood. Every story in this collection eventually has to answer the same quiet question. What does the town, the family, the community actually look like once the cameras and courtrooms move on? For Moscow, Idaho, that answer is still being written, nearly 3 years after a night that changed the town permanently. A community that had never prepared for this. Before November of 2022, Moscow was a place where residents left doors unlocked without a second thought, where the university and the town functioned as one tightly woven community rather than two separate worlds occupying the same small footprint. The murders didn't just take 4 young lives, they altered, in ways that outlasted the investigation itself, how an entire community understood its own safety. In the weeks and months following the killings, residents described a town transformed by a fear it had never previously needed to carry, new locks installed, new caution around walking alone at night, a University of Idaho campus that, for a period, felt fundamentally different than it had before that Saturday night. Some of that acute fear has, naturally, softened with time and with the case's eventual resolution. But those who lived through it have spoken, in various interviews conducted in the years since, about a lingering shift in how safe the town feels even now, an innocence, of sorts, that doesn't fully return once it's been taken. Remembering 4 names. It's worth ending this story the way we've tried to end each one in this collection, by returning attention to the people whose lives were actually lost, rather than letting the investigation's technical details or the courtroom drama become the final word. Madison Mogen and Kaylee Gonsalves were lifelong best friends, 21 years old, out for an ordinary Saturday night that should have ended, like countless nights before it, with nothing more eventful than a late food truck stop and a walk home. Zaina Kernadal was 20, sharing a home with her close friends, building the kind of life a college junior builds. Friendships, routines, a boyfriend in Ethan Chapin, 20 years old himself, staying over that night in the unremarkable, ordinary way college relationships often do. None of them could have known, in the hours before dawn on November 13th, that an unfamiliar figure was making his way toward their front door. That's the part of this story that resists any tidy narrative framing, not the forensic breakthrough, not the plea deal, not even the sentencing hearing where their families finally got to speak. Just four young people, at the beginning of lives that were taken from them for reasons that, even now, remain genuinely unexplained. What this case leaves behind. Unlike some of the older cases in this collection, this one is recent enough that its full legacy hasn't fully settled yet. The post-conviction proceedings remain active. The documentary specials continue to be produced. The forensic techniques that identified Koberger within weeks will likely continue shaping how future cases get solved, for better and for more complicated reasons alike, as genetic genealogy and digital forensics become increasingly standard tools in modern investigation. What's already clear, though, is this: a case that could easily have remained permanently unsolved. No witness able to fully identify an attacker, no murder weapon recovered, no confession offered until nearly 3 years after the fact, was instead resolved with striking speed, not through any single dramatic breakthrough, but through the patient, parallel convergence of touch DNA analysis, digital location data, and old-fashioned surveillance footage review, each thread reinforcing the others until together they left very little room for doubt. Spanning less than 3 years, from an ordinary Saturday night in a college town to a Boise courtroom where four families finally got to speak, even without ever getting the explanation they'd hoped for. A knife sheath left behind by mistake. A white sedan caught on grainy surveillance footage. A discarded Q-tip in a Pennsylvania trash can that close the distance between an unknown attacker and a name. And four young people, at the center of it all, whose lives deserved a far longer story than the one that was taken from them. Thank you for staying with this one all the way through.